The first time I realized my husband was hosting parties in my house while I was fighting to stay alive. I was sitting in the oncology ward at the cancer center, with a needle in my arm and a heat pad taped to my wrist to keep the vein from collapsing. My name is Vivian, and for 7 months chemotherapy had organized my entire life around one sentence: every other Thursday. Every other Thursday I woke before 6, ate a plain piece of toast because my stomach couldn't handle anything more, packed the small canvas bag my father had given me years ago, the one with the broken zipper I kept meaning to fix, and drove 40 minutes to the cancer center while the highway was still dark. I sat in the same green vinyl chair in Bay 4. I watched the same ceiling tiles for 4, sometimes 5 hours. I counted the same water stains above the IV pump and tried not to think about whether the chemo was actually working. I had hated those Thursdays, and I had hated coming home to an empty house even more. That was why, 8 months ago, when my oncologist confirmed the diagnosis, stage 2 breast cancer, aggressive subtype, aggressive treatment, my husband Garrett suggested his mother come and stay. She was retired, he said. She had nowhere to be. And I needed someone to be there when I got home from the infusion center, too exhausted to lift my own arms. I was 35 years old and I had never asked anyone for help in my life, but I said yes. His mother, Estelle, moved into the spare room on a Sunday in late October. She unpacked neatly, introduced herself to our neighbor Priscilla over the back fence, and told me she would handle meals and laundry and errands so I could rest. That first night she made a lamb stew that filled the whole house with warmth. I lay on the couch under a quilt my father had left behind and thought, maybe this won't be as hard as I thought. I should have known better than to feel that relieved. It was a Thursday in February when I first noticed something off. I was deep in my infusion, 3 hours in, the cold cap on my head to protect whatever hair I still had, the anti-nausea medication already making everything feel slightly underwater, when my phone buzzed on the armrest. It was Priscilla. Hey, just checking, are you guys having people over today? There are quite a few cars on the street. I read the message twice, then I typed back, not that I know of. Garrett's at work and his mom's home alone. Maybe she invited a friend or two. There are at least 9 or 10 cars, Viv. Just wanted to make sure you knew. I set the phone face down on my knee. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Estelle was sociable. She probably had sisters or cousins I hadn't met yet. People her age visited in the afternoon. But 9 or 10 cars. I called Garrett. He didn't answer, called again. Straight to voicemail. I texted, is your mom having people over? He replied 20 minutes later. She mentioned something about a few friends stopping in. Nothing to worry about. I looked at the IV line running into my arm. I looked at the ceiling, and for the first time, I felt a small cold thing settle somewhere behind my sternum that had nothing to do with the chemo. When I got home that afternoon, the front hallway smelled like cologne and candle wax, the kind of smell that takes hours to build up. Estelle appeared from the kitchen, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, her smile unchanged. She asked if I was hungry, said she'd made soup, said I looked tired. She touched my shoulder in that practiced, gentle way she had and guided me toward the couch as if I were made of something breakable. I sat down slowly and looked around the room. Everything appeared normal. The furniture was in place. The throw pillows were stacked exactly as I'd left them. But something was wrong, and I couldn't name it yet. Later, when Estelle went upstairs to bring me a blanket, I walked into the kitchen and opened the dishwasher. There were glasses inside, tall cocktail glasses, the kind we only used for parties. 16, maybe 18 of them, all washed, all standing in a neat row. I closed the dishwasher carefully. In the living room, I noticed something else. My father's leather armchair. The one he'd sat in every Sunday of my childhood, the one I'd moved into this house because I couldn't give it away, had been pushed 6 inches to the left. There was a faint circular mark on the hardwood where a drinks coaster had sat, and on the right armrest, barely visible, a small dark burn mark, like someone had rested a lit cigarette there and forgotten it. I stood very still, looking at that burn mark. When Estelle came back downstairs, I pointed to the chair. I asked as calmly as I could whether anyone had been sitting in it. She glanced at it. She said one of her friends had probably sat there by accident. She said she'd look at the mark in better light tomorrow. I nodded. I said thank you for the blanket. But I did not forget that burn mark. Not for a single minute of that night. The following week, Priscilla came over while Garrett was at work, and Estelle was running errands. She stood in my kitchen with her coat still on and held her mug with both hands and looked at me the way people look at you when they've been deciding for days whether to say something. I told her to just say it. She set her mug down. She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table. I started keeping track, she said quietly, because I thought maybe I was imagining things. She showed me photographs taken from her upstairs window, my driveway, my front walk, the street. Cars, 8, 10, 12 at a time. Thursdays every other Thursday like clockwork. The dates aligned exactly with my chemo schedule. She scrolled to a video she'd taken from her bedroom window. It was shaky, shot through glass, but I could see the front door of my house opening repeatedly. People going in. A man, Garrett, standing on the porch with an envelope in his hand, receiving something from a couple walking up the front steps. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without even looking down. I watched the video twice. "What's in the envelopes?" I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Priscilla looked at her hands. "I'm not certain. But it happened every time. People arrive, he's at the door, and they hand him something before they go inside." I sat down. I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to find the explanation that made my husband look like a decent person. Maybe the envelopes were cards. Maybe a relative was going through something, and people were contributing. Maybe I had misread everything. But I knew what I'd seen. "Don't say anything yet," Priscilla said. "Not until you know exactly what's been happening." That evening I told Garrett I was going to bed early. I said the fatigue had hit harder than usual. He kissed my forehead and said he'd bring up water and crackers, in case I needed them in the night. He was so careful with me, so steady and attentive. I lay in the dark for an hour. Then I got up and went to the storage room at the end of the hall. My father had been a careful man. Quiet, practical, the kind of person who read the instructions before assembling anything and kept every receipt for 7 years. After he passed, I'd boxed up most of his things and kept them in that room without going through them properly. There'd been too much grief in it. I'd been meaning to sort the boxes for over a year. I pulled the first one open. Old tax files. The second, tools, organized by size. The third, a small wireless security camera still in its original packaging. And beneath it, an old tablet in a gray case with a yellow sticky note on the back in my father's handwriting. "Living room, activated DEC 2021. I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking when I turned the tablet on. It connected to the camera's local storage after a few minutes of loading. The footage went back several months. I almost didn't look. I almost put it back in the box and told myself it wasn't my place, that these were still my husband and his mother and I owed them more trust than this. But I thought about those envelopes. I thought about the burn mark on my father's armchair. I pressed play. The first few recordings showed ordinary things. Estelle folding dish towels, the cat moving across the carpet, Garrett eating cereal standing at the counter. Nothing alarming. Then I found a Thursday recording. The timestamp showed 8:54 a.m., 20 minutes after I'd left for the cancer center. I watched myself back out of the driveway in my winter coat, the canvas bag on the passenger seat. The living room was empty for a few minutes. Then Estelle appeared. She made a phone call, smiling at something the person on the other end said. She hung up and started moving the furniture, pushing my father's armchair to the side, sliding the coffee table against the wall, pulling folding chairs from the hall closet I didn't know she'd found. Then, people started arriving. My living room filled. There were 30, maybe 40 people at one point, laughing, drinking, moving through spaces that had only ever held my family. A woman sat in my father's armchair and balanced a glass on the armrest. A man I'd never seen in my life leaned against the wall where my parents' old photograph had once hung. I watched Garrett at the front door. I watched every envelope. Then I found the recording that stopped me completely. Garrett was talking to a man near the window. The man was asking questions. I could read the conversation in their body language, the gestures, the way Garrett nodded and glanced around the room. I turned up the volume. The man asked, "She's at the cancer center until what time?" Garrett said, 4 usually, sometimes closer to 4:30 if there are delays. The man looked around the room. "And she doesn't know any of this is happening?" Garrett laughed quietly. "She comes home exhausted. She barely makes it to the couch. She's not going to notice a few extra glasses in the dishwasher." I pressed pause. I sat on the floor of the storage room with the tablet on my knees, and I did not move for several minutes. The house was quiet. I could hear the furnace running. I could hear Garrett's voice downstairs. Some late-night television show turned low. I pressed play again. A later recording. Estelle and Garrett talking in my kitchen. The sound was harder to catch, but the camera had picked up enough. Estelle, the Hendersons asked again about the square footage. Garrett quieter. I told them to wait. Estelle, you can't wait forever, Garrett. A pause. Garrett, I know, but it's not the right time yet. Estelle's voice dropped lower. I leaned forward and turned the volume to maximum. She said, if the treatments stop working, we can list by spring. The market's still strong. Garrett didn't answer immediately, then he said, either way, we need a plan. I set the tablet down very slowly, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped feeling like yours. I had spent 7 months making myself go back to that chair in Bay 4. 7 months letting nurses find a vein in my arm, watching my white cell count on a printout, swallowing nausea medication, before I even got out of bed on Thursday mornings. I had done it because I wanted to be here. Because I wanted more time, more winters, more slow Sunday mornings, more evenings sitting in my father's chair with a book and nowhere to be. And the 2 people I had let into my home had been holding conversations about listing it by spring. About having a plan. For when the treatment stopped working. I went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists until my hands steadied. In the mirror I looked smaller than I remembered. My face was pale and the headscarf I'd started wearing made me look older than 35. But I was still standing, still at my own sink in my own house. I whispered to my reflection, this is your house. The next morning I called Agnes, a family lawyer Priscilla had used, when she'd gone through her own divorce 3 years ago. Agnes agreed to see me that afternoon. I drove there without telling Garrett where I was going. I sat across from her at a wooden desk and slid a copy of my father's will across the surface. She read it carefully. She asked a few questions. Then she looked up and told me what I already suspected, but needed to hear from someone who could put it in legal terms. The house was in my name alone. My father had transferred it to me 18 months before he passed. And because Garrett and I had never formalized joint ownership, something Garrett had mentioned, wanting to do several times, something I had kept delaying without understanding why I kept delaying it, and now I understood perfectly. It was entirely, legally, unambiguously mine. No one could sell it, mortgage it, or make decisions about it without my knowledge and consent. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have written down and kept since that day. She said, being unwell doesn't make your home less yours. It makes protecting it more important. I drove home. I fed the cat. I made myself tea. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. Estelle came in from the backyard, brushing snow off her boots. She asked if I'd eaten. She asked if I'd rested. She set a clementine on the counter near my mug without being asked because she knew I liked them. I said I had something to take care of and asked if she and Garrett could both be home on Saturday morning. She said of course, whatever I needed. On Saturday, I waited until they were both in the kitchen. Then I unlocked my phone, opened the tablet's saved footage on my screen, and set it on the table between us. I said, I found Dad's old security camera. Estelle went very still. Garrett turned around from the counter. I looked at them both and asked quietly, how long? Garrett started talking immediately, about the cost of things, about how hard the past 7 months had been on them too, about how the money they'd collected from guests had gone toward groceries and household expenses and contributions to my medical costs. He used careful language. He made it sound practical, almost generous. I waited until he finished. Then I asked, did I ever give you permission to charge people to come into my house? He looked at the table. Did you ask me whether you could move my father's chair? Estelle made a sound, not a word, just a breath. I picked up my phone and played the kitchen recording. The 2 of them stood in silence and listened to Estelle's voice saying, if the treatments stop working, we can list by spring. Listen to Garrett saying, either way, we need a plan. The kitchen was completely still. Estelle covered her mouth. Garrett said, that's not what it. I said, I've listened to it 11 times, I know exactly what it is. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his face. Not remorse, not quite. Something more like the expression of a person who has been caught and is now recalculating. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the house key my father had given me the day he signed the transfer documents. It had a small maple leaf fob he'd bought at a craft market the summer before he got sick. I'd kept it on my keyring because taking it off felt like losing another small piece of him. I set it on the table between us. My father left me this house so I would always have somewhere safe, I said. You turned it into a venue while I was sitting in a cancer ward with a drip in my arm. Garrett tried again. He said he loved me. He said he'd been frightened. He said fear had made him do something he wasn't proud of. I told him that fear was what got me out of bed every other Thursday morning, when everything in me wanted to stay under the covers. That I understood fear better than he ever would. Then I told them both they needed to leave. They didn't argue. That surprised me more than anything. I had braced for anger, for accusations, for Estelle listing everything she had done for me over the past 8 months. Instead they went upstairs, and I heard drawers opening and closing, quiet, methodical, like people finishing a task they'd known was coming. An hour later, Garrett's car was loaded. Estelle came into the kitchen one last time. She stood near the doorway and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not the confident, organized woman who had moved my furniture and planned her son's future in my home. Just someone who looked tired and older and uncertain of herself. She said, "I do hope you know the treatments are going to work." I didn't answer her. After the front door closed, the house was completely quiet. I walked into the living room and moved my father's armchair back to its place, the position it had held for so many years that the hardwood was lighter where the legs had sat. I pushed it back until the pale outlines matched. Then I sat down in it. The burn mark was still on the armrest. I laid my palm over it and sat there for a while. That evening I got dizzy walking from the living room to the kitchen, and had to hold the wall to stay upright. I sank onto the floor with my back against the cabinet, and my phone in my hand. I scrolled without thinking to Garrett's name, and then I stopped. I sat there on my kitchen floor, looking at his name on the screen. I wanted to call someone who would come and sit with me. I needed that more than I'd needed most things in my life. And the person I would have called 6 months ago, the person I had believed would always come, had just driven away with suitcases packed. I called Priscilla instead. She arrived in 12 minutes. She came in, found me on the kitchen floor, and sat down beside me. Not in a chair, not on the other side of the room, right beside me on the cold tile floor, close enough that her shoulder was pressing into mine. We sat there a long time. Eventually she asked if I'd eaten anything since morning. I said no. She got up and found eggs, and made us both scrambled eggs on toast, which she carried to the living room on a cutting board, because I didn't want to eat at the kitchen table alone. We sat on the couch and ate in front of the television with the sound turned low. I thought about what it meant that the person who had shown up was the one who lived next door. Not the husband who had moved in to take care of me, not the mother-in-law who had memorized my medication schedule. Just Priscilla who had noticed the cars. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. I still went to the cancer center every other Thursday. I still sat in Bay 4. I still counted ceiling tiles. But now I came home to a house that was entirely mine again. Quiet, still, and mine. And I had to learn how to be inside it without waiting for someone else to fill it up. Some days I missed things about Garrett I hadn't expected to miss. Not the large things, the small ones. The way he kept the car topped up with gas through the winter, so I never had to stop at a station in the cold. The way he remembered which brand of crackers I could keep down during the worst nausea, and always had a box on the counter before I even asked. I miss those things. I let myself miss them, then I let them go. I arranged my own rides to the cancer center through a volunteer transport program I hadn't known about until my oncologist social worker mentioned it. I set up medication deliveries. Priscilla came by twice a week without being asked and never made me feel like I owed her anything for it. And slowly, carefully, like learning to trust a floor you've fallen through before, I started to feel like myself again. 3 months after Garrett moved out, my oncologist called me into her office instead of the usual chair in Bay 4. She sat across from me with my latest scan results and used words like encouraging and on track and next phase of monitoring. She said, if the next round of results were consistent, we could begin the conversation about moving from active treatment to surveillance. I sat in her office and cried, not quietly, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere you didn't know was that full until it opens. She handed me a box of tissues and waited without filling the silence. When I drove home, I sat in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The front walk needed shoveling. The porch light had been flickering for 2 weeks, and I kept forgetting to replace the bulb. There were small things everywhere that needed tending, and I had been tending to them alone, and somehow I was still here. I went inside. I moved through all the rooms slowly, the way I had done the first day I walked through this house, after my father's name came off. The deed and mine went on. I looked at the walls and the floors and the corners and the places where old photographs had hung. I put my hand on the back of my father's armchair and stood there for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table with my phone. I had 12 unread messages from Garrett sent over the past weeks in intervals that grew shorter as my silence continued. I had 3 missed calls from Estelle. I had not responded to any of them. I thought about what Priscilla had said the week I'd told her the whole story. That forgiving someone didn't mean going back to them. That sometimes you did it quietly, privately, for the only reason that matters, so the weight of it stops living inside you alongside everything else you're already carrying. I opened Garrett's most recent message. It said he was sorry, that he'd had time to think, that he hoped we could talk. I typed 1 sentence. The treatments are working. The house is mine. Take care of yourself. I sent it. I set my phone face down on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the late afternoon light was doing something quiet and beautiful with the snow on the cedar hedges. It was March. The days were already getting longer. Soon the whole yard would be muddy and then green, and I would sit in my father's armchair with the back door open and listen to the neighborhood and feel the particular kind of silence I had spent a long time mistaking for loneliness. I wrapped both hands around my mug. I sat in my house, in the stillness I had chosen, and for the first time in 7 months, I thought not about what I was fighting against, but about everything I was still here to fight for. If my story reached you, I'd love to know, could you have walked away from someone who made plans for your house while you were fighting for your life? Subscribe to Family Shadows for a new story every day, and leave me your answer in the comments. I read every single one.